Well, welcome to unit number 10. In this unit, we're going to be covering quite a deal of material, and in covering it, there are only a number of things I want you particularly to, in a sense, take away. If you look at the objectives of this course, you'll be able to see that there are certain objectives or things you need to know that are being described in terms of be aware of things, be acquainted with things. This is a lecture which has two primary foci. Number one is Hobbes and the other is Pascal, and then understand the change in the way science was done. Also to have an understanding of materialism in general. So with that in mind, I invite you to take a moment to print off the worksheet. This one for this class, really quite important to use it because it'll help you to understand where I'm going with this lecture. I'm going to move fairly quickly. You'll need to sort of follow along. You can go back if you like and fill in later using the PowerPoint notes. They'll help you a great deal. The material contains a lot of background material as well, so that if you happen to be doing essays on topics other than some of the major people who've mentioned in the coursework, because you have the freedom to do that, of course, perhaps some of the material here will help you, especially in materialism if you wanted to go on to the modern era. There's, if you like, suggestions which will point you in the right direction, I hope. All right, so let's take a moment now and print off our worksheets and be ready to continue. Well, I hope you've been able to print off your worksheets. I've mentioned pretty well where we're going to be going, so let's start off with the Renaissance and then move to the Reformation. And we're focusing primarily on the key implications of these movements as they form the background to the development of philosophy in the modern era, and help us understand, I think, the role of Descartes. I have listed here some key figures for you, as we'll mention them. Try to give you some indication of their chronological order of birth. You'll notice they cover the period we're talking about. They're all key players. In a moment I'll show you a much larger list of key players, but I thought to introduce you to these. Very significant in this period is Erasmus. He lay a foundation for some enormous amount of opportunity of scholarship, as did Francis Bacon and, of course, Hobbes. Pascal is interesting because he completes, in a sense, a tradition. And indeed, when we come to consider him, we'll actually consider him before we consider materialism and Hobbes in particular. So let's move then to the Reformation, to the Renaissance, I beg your pardon. As you can see, I think from this slide and also from your own background study in other subjects here at the college, and perhaps from even your high school education, that the Renaissance really opened up Europe to new learning. It was a period of time in which people began to have sufficient resources and freedom to begin to learn to read and to study and to have literature. It is one of the strange benefits of the Crusades, as a matter of fact, that brought a lot of material from the East back into Europe and introduced people to a wide variety of pieces of information about classical studies and history. Now, when I say increase the number of people having the education, I mean by this that the rise of the middle class becomes important. The entrepreneurs, the burghers, the people in Italy who were involved in business and banking, the people who in the Low Countries and in England and in France and in other countries were involved in trade. There was a growing wealth in Europe, and really quite important. And I've drawn out for you some implications at the bottom of this slide. The common language of intellectual study was Latin, and many of the ancient texts, both Arabic, Greek, and Latin, were being made available to people. And they're very important. All these Latin translations, the common language of learning, not the common language of the people, but the common language of learning. And this, of course, is Erasmus's great contribution. He was a great intellectual mind who opened up many texts available. He was not alone, of course. He's just one of the very well-known leaders and one of the very, very important people who made a contribution in that respect. And again, I've pointed out that more people are involved in education, learning and scholarship. In other words, the theory of the great universities is underway, the development of schools is expanding, education is becoming available to more and more middle-class people, and that becomes quite important. And then, of course, we have the printing press coming on the scene at the end of this period. Well, we're in the middle of the period. And it gave wide availability to news, pamphlets, books, publications. It was the new media of the time. It also meant that in the background, the Bible, which to this point in time had not been available even to the educated class. It's one of the strange things that the Bible's Latin translations of the Bible, for example, were not available to even most educated people, not until really the time of the Reformation. But the printing press was going to change all of that. There was also a growing interest in new ideas. People were open to change. And there was an explosion of the arts. I mean, this is the period of Renaissance where things changed. Just for interest, here are some key figures. The ones on the left-hand side of your screen: Erasmus, Hobbes, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes. These are people we'll look at and we're interested in. I've got some notes under who they are and what they did. You can see each of them have the contribution. But on the right-hand side, you get some idea of the wide expanse of people who were involved in the Renaissance. There were people of letters and learning and having impact in a wide variety of sciences and arts. There was a real explosion of people knowing and looking at the world and thinking about the world and what's going on in the world. And so, with that in mind, let's briefly look at Erasmus. Here I've given you some information on him and his background, and hopefully you find that interesting. And the fact that he was a churchman shouldn't distract you from the great contribution that he made in terms of raising influential questions. And it's really this last point that one should not lose sight of. And I'm going to highlight it so you can see it here as we're talking. He prepared important new Latin and Greek editions of the New Testament. And once he did that, he raised questions about what was going on in the church at the time. He didn't intend to raise questions or cause a problem, but he by translating it and making it available to people, people began to read the New Testament. The scholarly people involved in scholarship, meant to say, we've got a problem here between what's going on in the church and what we read in the Scripture, and the church is supposed to be a reflection of Scripture. And perhaps that gives us some background to the development within this wide period of the Renaissance, the impact of the 15th and 16th century Reformation. I think everyone's heard of Martin Luther. He's the famous founder of the Protestant church movement in Germany, who pounded the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg church door and raised these questions that arose out of the work of Erasmus and others. He was followed by John Calvin, who first had the first systematic theology, and he was also a philosopher and a theologian combined. That's another issue. But what was very important in this period of time, we can't leave out Frederick of Saxony or Henry VIII. These two political leaders, for sincere faith reasons as well as good politics, were concerned to establish their own independence from what was known as the Holy Roman Empire and from the control of the papacy. When you study history, I hope you'll look into this whole period. It'll help you understand our own Western civilization. And it's also the origin of how nations really blossomed out of this period of time. Frederick and Henry were already establishing their own kingdoms. And in so doing, they saw the need to establish a church within their realm which was independent from the control of outside influences. And so we have the development of the Lutheran Church in Germany and the Church of England in England. And again, we're looking at the impact of these things. I'll give you some information on these people in this moment. Again, the movement that takes place within the framework of the Reformation is a movement to take the Latin translations of the Bible and to translate them into the language of the people, so that now we have the need for ordinary men and women, not necessarily serfs, but ordinary, if you like, working class people, to have some education so they can read the Bible. And the Bible's becoming the issue. What does the Bible teach? Which is really part of the Reformation movement. And as a result of that, one of the interesting is there were translations of the Bible into German, to French, to English, the languages of the people. And again, this widens people's interest in education. It widens their interest in reading. And it means that the other publications that are part of education, of broader education, such as philosophy, are also going to be discussed. And so it's going to be important for the philosophers who follow to be able to connect between the people, the new sciences, what's going on in the Bible, all these multiple strains of thought that are there. And it helps you to understand. For example, in Hobbes' case, who insists he's a theist and yet insists that the only pure spirit is God and everything else is matter, or material, I should say. And so it's an interesting movement. And again, it is the printing press that produces all kinds of flyers, pamphlets, discussions that drive the Reformation. And this is a popular movement. The Renaissance was a wide cultural movement, but the Reformation was a popular movement, which again took people to the press. And as a result, we had the national identities of local Christian churches. In other words, you have the Church of France, you have the Church of England, you have the Church in Holland, you have the Church in Germany. The churches become national churches. And if you look around here in the United States, where we are today, you'll see many churches that bear the names of their ethnic origins. You may have Greek Orthodox, you might have Russian Orthodox, you may have these national churches. You have the Lutheran Church, and you have various branches of the Lutheran Church, which in many ways represent different traditions of the national churches, which are their origins. And of course, the popularizing of education. I've given you some notes here on Frederick of Saxony and on Henry VIII of England. I'll leave you to look at those for yourselves. I'm going to turn now to the philosophical situation and to look at it. We're going to come in a moment to look at the conceptual change, if you like, the philosophy of science change that takes place during this period. There's a philosophy of science which existed at the time of Plato and Aristotle and through to the time of the Renaissance. And then with the scientific revolution, there becomes a new philosophy of science. And we just briefly look at the things that brought this about. Some of these I think you're fully aware of. Astronomy has made an important contribution. The Greeks began with this geocentric model, which was the basis of their thinking. That model had a theory of the universe which placed the Earth at the centre and everything revolving around it. And this was commonly held by Plato, by Aristotle in particular, Ptolemy, and most Greek philosophers assumed the sun, the moon, the stars were indeed planets flying around the Earth. And it was only one, Aristarchus, who really questioned that model. Indeed, he tended to say that the Earth was not central. And of course we have Copernicus, and this brings us into the period of the early Renaissance. Born in Poland, studied in Italy. Interesting, he begins to critique the model because of his observations. And, interestingly, because he researched ancient documents, both from the Greco-Roman tradition and the Arabic world, and he developed a sun-centered solar system. and I think you know enough about that to realise this was more than controversial because of the faith and reason debate which was going on in the background, in which faith and reason were viewed by the double truth theory which existed after Augustine, which meant that so long as there was no conflict between the truths of science, philosophy and learning, and the truths of religion, there was no problem. But suddenly there was viewed to be a problem which was going to create a discussion and debate which has continued even to this day. The Gregorian calendar was developed. There's an interesting story behind it, replacing the Julian calendar. And what's important about it is Copernicus's views. And there's also the background history here, by the way, of the story of navigation and the trying to develop how you would find the longitude position when you're navigating. If you're interested in sailing or history of navigation, that becomes an interesting topic and an interesting point of debate. Kepler, of course, a German mathematician and an astronomer. He wrote works in the 17th century. Again, he's following the same pattern and beginning to say the importance of the sun-based view of the cosmos, and again based on observation. An important contributor is Francis Bacon. Interesting man, but what's important is what's in red about him. Yes, he was a statesman. Yes, he was. He was. Oh, by the way, there's interesting. Well, I won't go into the story of how he killed himself, but anyway, what was important was his works and his essays established and popularised. And what's important is in red. He emphasised the importance of inductive methodology for scientific inquiry. Now, if you remember back to our discussion of logic, in that discussion of logic, we emphasised that you need to understand the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, which begins from the whole, all A are B, and inductive reasoning, which begins with the particular, which is inherent in scientific reason. We see this item, and we try to draw out of it some kind of conclusion by some methodology. And he emphasized the scientific method, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. But he is really the first person to talk about the essentialness of inductive methodology and calling it the new scientific method. And it's important to realize at the very bottom of the slide, he rejected Aristotle's syllogisms. He rejected the supremacy of deductive reasoning. He said, for something true, it doesn't necessarily have to be deductive. There's more truth than that. And by the way, if you recall our discussion again on logic, I pointed out to you the three categories. You had deductive, you had reasoning which was logical, following the laws of reason. You had reasoning which was irrational, it was against the rules of reasoning. And you had non-rational reasoning in the middle. And this is really inductive reasoning. Remember I said to you, it can be just as certain as deductive. Well, in a sense, Francis Bacon wants to go one step further. He wants to say that inductive reasoning is in fact superior. Because he wanted to insist that knowledge came only through the senses. Now, I can come back to that on a number of occasions, especially when it comes to Locke and Hume. Well, one can't leave this discussion without talking about Galileo, and of course his role of using observations, and it's very important, to confirm Copernicus's hypotheses. Now let's see that. Here we reach a point where it is Galileo who takes the various arguments that Copernicus had made, based, yes, on observations, but also he was researching the documents, and comes up with a hypothesis. And it is Copernicus who engages in a series of observational experiments to confirm the hypothesis of Copernicus. Important. Now, René Descartes contributes to the to the Renaissance, and we'll come back to him in our very next lecture in Unit 11. So I'm not going to talk much about what he did here. I'll come back to talk about that at that point in time. We can't leave this without talking briefly about Isaac Newton and reminding ourselves that he is the father of the three laws of motion. There they are at the bottom of the screen in blue. I presume you remember those from your school days. He sets that in motion. That's going to become important when we come also to look at Hobbes's view of what is materialism. But before we go there, we do two things. The first is we want to talk about the philosophical conception, the philosophical idea of what was pre-Renaissance science and post-Renaissance science. And what is crucial here is that you'll notice that the pre-Renaissance science involved observation, but also involved speculative reasoning. In other words, deductive reasoning, trying to take everything in deductive form and making your basis on that. And it's been called, since Locke and Hume, speculative reasoning. It's really an unfair title for it. It's using the laws of reason, strictly speaking, as best you can. And we've been using some of those as we've been giving illustrations of using speculative reason. It basically is using the strict rules of logic. Whereas the post-Renaissance science used empirical observations, experiments. The reason they're empirical, you're looking at using the senses and the observations, and you're using them in a technical sense. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then you're going to use inductive reasoning. You're going to go from this experiment, and you're going to draw out implication as to what comes about. And you're going to have, generally speaking, you're going to work out if you've done enough experiments and the highest percentage that indicates you're being right. In other words, the final proof point for post-Renaissance science is probably statistics. Whereas the final proof for pre-Renaissance science was speculative reasoning. Did it meet the standards of reasoning? Just look at the details. You can see them here. I've given them to you. Looking at the pre-Renaissance method, you observe the cosmos. You use reason to evaluate the observations you make. And that involves using deductive reason to produce a conclusion. And so far as their experiments are concerned, or observations, you're simply implementing the references, implementing the inferences that come from that. Whereas empirical science, this is the sort of science you did at school when you were doing chemistry, assuming you had a lab and you were able to do some experiments. You come up with a thesis. It's drafted in relation to an issue, a question, or a problem. And then you design a series of experiments to validate or invalidate the thesis. And part of the design involves the number and type of experiments you'll conduct that give you a confidence in your conclusion. That's the role of inductive reasoning and mathematical probabilities that are involved. So the conclusion is validated or invalid. The thesis is either validated or invalidated by these experiments. And that's the way we have been taught science and the way we do science, and it's the new scientific method. Now, we don't want to throw pre-Renaissance science out the window because it made a lot of very fine observations and conclusions, and today we still use it. A lot of higher math, which is effectively strictly rational reasoning. And so it's, I would encourage you to realize we use both, but the dominance today is on the right-hand side of the screen. But it does represent a major shift in the approach to thinking and science. Now, while Pascal comes after, in terms of time of birth, after Hobbes, I just want to stop with Pascal before I go on to deal with materialism, and just to briefly talk about Pascal. He is a Renaissance person. Just look at his contributions. I've got a whole list of them there. What an astonishing man he was. What's important, though, is he addressed two particular issues for us that we want to take note of in the line of the discussions we've had in this course. One is the faith and reason debate, and the other is the proofs for the existence of God. Um, he had a religious conversion in 1654, and he began to write on issues of faith and reason and on other theological topics that actually got him into a lot of trouble. Remember that by this time, the 1650s, the Inquisition is on full swing, and when you start questioning the church, and given the problems of the growing Reformation in the background, the situation in France was not comfortable for someone who was asking awkward questions. But he did address this issue of faith and reason. Now you recall that up to the time of the Renaissance, as we mentioned in our discussion of Augustine and of Aquinas, that there had been two approaches to thinking about the relationship of faith and reason. The dominant one was the double truth. The religious truth is true, and scientific, that is, philosophy and mathematics, true. The problem was that as far as the church was concerned, where those came into conflict, the church was tending to say what the church says, what is church doctrine, must override. Hence the struggle over the battle with Galileo and his his confirming observations of the sun being the centre of the universe, of the solar system. The double truth. Remember that Aquinas came along and said, look, I want to find a bridge between pure religious knowledge and knowledge that we have by experience. And he creates this natural law, natural knowledge, natural truth, which is his bridge. In the background, of course, is the famous statements of Augustine, faith-seeking understanding, confirmed by others as well. So what does Pascal contribute to this debate? Well, Pascal had a view of knowledge, and I'll come to that in a moment, but he ends up making a very famous statement. He says, the heart has its reasons which the reason does not understand. In other words, he in a sense seems to accept the double truth concept, but he wants to say the heart has reason. It's a different approach to reason. Now, what's important is I've written definition there. Just try to remember what it was and be aware of that. Let's just come to his epistemology, because it's quite interesting. He was convinced that certain basic propositions of our thinking could not be demonstrated. Now, the basic propositions, certain basic things can't be demonstrated or proven. They're there. In a sense, he is reflecting something of the work of Augustine, and he's laying the foundation for what was going on in what was known as Reformed epistemology, part of the Reformation's thinking about the role of innate knowledge in the background. In other words, not a rejection of knowledge by experience, but the concept that involved with that experiential knowledge, there is an innate knowledge. We're not going to go into that, but this is his basic starting point. He says certain propositions of our thinking cannot be demonstrated. Hence, he's convinced that the reasoning in religious and spiritual matters had its own requirements, and that the reasoning in the empirical area of the cosmos had another set of requirements. In a sense, he is separating himself from both Augustine and Aquinas. Now, if we come now to his argument for the existence of God is really quite different, and if you have any knowledge of these things, you better know this one. It's known as Pascal's wager. And so he invites his readers to enter into a gambling world of risk-taking. Now, behind this assumption, or this whole Pascal's wager, can only be understood if you realise that in the mindset of the Renaissance and Reformation era, if you believed in God, you believed there was a heaven and a hell, and if you believed in God, whatever the religious approach you had would eventually get you to heaven. If you didn't believe in God, then that particular religious choice, not believing in God, would lead you inevitably to hell. What Pascal does is invite us to enter into a world of gambling. And I've set out for you Pascal's wager in blue at the bottom of your screen. here we go. If God exists and we believe in him, then our reward will be infinite. Heaven. If God exists and we do not believe in him, then we'll lose out on that reward. Then he goes on, this is not a logical argument. If God does not exist, and we believe in him, we've gained or lost nothing. If God does not exist and we believe in him, we've gained or lost nothing. Interesting concept. And if God does not exist and we do believe him, we've gained or lost nothing. And there's a mistake in mine. The first one is, if God does exist, we've gained. So the not in the second one needs to be removed. That's a mistake. I'll correct that in the notes that you have posted. Sorry for that error that's there. You better follow through with that. So the wager invites the reader to consider the options, and of course, you bet the way to win. Interesting. All right, time to move on now to materialism. So let's start there. As we come to materialism, we have to take a moment to reflect. We've mentioned metaphysical dualism and metaphysical monism when we're talking about the pre-Socratics. Metaphysical dualism is the belief that there are two fundamental realities in terms of the cosmos, if you like, heaven and earth, in terms of people, body and soul. If you're a monist, then you believe there's only one fundamental substance. If you're a pluralist, you believed in many fundamental substances. But some in history wanted to make the metaphysical choice between saying that there could be two realities, but only one will actually exist. The first is the fundamental reality is the mind. Now, at the moment, I imagine that's a bit of a surprise to you. That's called idealism. We'll look more at that when we come to Berkeley, and to some extent we'll briefly look at it in terms of Descartes. He's not quite in that category, but the reality of the mind. And that's the only real substance. Alternatively, reality is fundamentally matter. It's material. And there are two traditions here. What we're going to spend a little time looking at materialism. We're going to use Hobbes as our key representative of it. And hopefully we'll come back and be able to contrast the two, idealism and materialism, a little later when we get to Berkeley. But that's a little way down the course for us yet. Well then, if you want to say everything is primarily matter, Ed Miller, in his significant work on philosophy, when he introduces philosophy, makes the comment that the metaphysical doctrine, and he's about materialism, that matter with its motions and qualities is the ultimate reality of all things. And what's important here is to understand that materialists are not arguing it's just simply static, that matter is not just the static things that we hold, like a rock, a tree, a body, but it's everything that makes up the material life. Motions and qualities, things that move, and the quality of things, soft and hard, quick and moving, all of those things make up all of matter. Now the pre-Socratics weren't quite as sophisticated as that in their definitions, I've listed some of them, but the more contemporary, beginning introducing the modern era, people like Hobbes and Isaac Newton were. There are others who contributed to this area of materialism. J.J. Smart, an Australian, J.J.C. Smart, an Australian, he's just passed away a year or two ago, Richard Taylor, Danto, and B.F. Skinner made some contributions using materialism as a background to his approach to psychotherapy. So with that in mind, let's move on. We won't get time to cover many of these people, but we're going to focus on Hobbes. But before we do so, we need to understand the distinction between a narrow view of naturalism and a wider view of naturalism. The narrow view defines nature as the physical world and we could call that materialism. The wider view of naturalism defines nature more broadly to include not just matter, but also many dimensional aspects of nature. Materialism focuses on the first of those. So again, we are distinguishing materialism from any popular preoccupations with the earthly goods. By good, I mean moral goods and other kinds of goods. We're focusing on the technical sense. Matter with its motions and qualities is the ultimate reality of all things. Does materialism mean the denial of the mind? Perhaps a question of interest. Well, I'll leave you to look at the slides. Let's go and do a little bit of background before we get to Hobbes. Isaac Newton, just bring him back into a focus with the 3 laws of motion. Why is that important? We've mentioned this before, so we'll just pass by that quickly. Now to Hobbes. Remember those 3 laws, and we'll come back to them in a moment. First, we look at his metaphysics. He said there were 2 realities, the corporeal and the incorporeal. Now, Hobbes asserts he's a theist, but he says the idea or the notion of spirit or non-material substances, that takes us back to our friend Aristotle, he says that has to be reserved for God alone. His argument is going to be based on the idea that in the world of human experience, in the world of the 3-dimensional world we live in the context of what we can know, then we have to realize that spirit or non-material has to be moved to the divine. And he inserts that one thing is spirit and everything else is matter, and with its motions. What's pure spirit? Answer God. Now, thus, he's a metaphysical monist. He believes only one reality. Now, he calls the world corporeal and the world of spirit incorporeal. This is the heart of his discussion in Leviathan, particularly chapter 46. What is important here is Hobbes makes an observation about the way things happen in this world. He insists that the laws of nature require that everything must happen in accordance with those laws. So Hobbes is a mechanical materialist or a mechanistic materialist. And I've tried to highlight this distinction for you in, I hope, a helpful definition. He's arguing that not only are all things reducible to matter and motions and located in space and time, that's a materialist view, but he asserts that all things have their particular features according to a finite number of fixed physical laws, the laws of nature, based around what was going on in science. In other words, he looks at life in this world. He says it's governed by the rules of nature, the laws of nature, if you will. And these laws we've come to know and to understand. Well, the question then arises, okay, he's going to say that we are bodies, the world is made up of physical matter, material, along with its motions and qualities. Then we have to ask the question, well, how do we know anything? Hobbes' epistemology. Now, as a metaphysical monist, this means that the mind, the soul, and the body are one. It means that the mind is a biological machine. Hobbes is an empiricist. He knows things by the senses. But if the mind's a machine, can it have hardwire knowledge? In other words, would Hobbes be able to seriously argue that the mind knows absolutely nothing? Of course, if you define that hardwire knowledge as being instinct or something else, then quite clearly you could argue that. But the bigger and important question is, if the mind is just a biological machine, how could the brain become creative and inventive? Is it just an artificial intelligence machine? how do you explain it? And with his value theory, we have another question. How do you, if we are just a machine and we can operate only according to a fixed set of number of laws, the laws of nature, well, what makes us unique as human beings, distinct over against other biological machines? Perhaps one might say, well, that's exactly what many people in the ecology movement are arguing, that there is fundamentally no difference between us and other forms of animals. Now, in classical philosophy, it is rationality that separates us. In many forms of religion, it's the soul, made in the image of God, that separates us and makes us unique beings. But the question still remains. Are we different, and what makes us different? And if we're just a biological machine, and this really is very significant, then we're not free moral agents. We're not truly free. If we have to make our decisions according to a fixed set of rules that are inherently part of nature, then we're not free moral agents. And how then do we explain morality and ethics and justice? And how do we hold people accountable? For this is really true. We have no right to put anyone in prison. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this question by posing it in such ways that as you come to that there's no answer to this. Many materialists have some very interesting arguments in relation to moral theory and in relation to knowledge. I'm posing these as starting points for you and giving you an essential issue. But it does raise an important question over against free will and determinism. In the past, we've been talking about free will, and we assumed we had some idea what that meant, and we had some number of interesting discussions, particularly as we came to Augustine, who wants to say, well, we don't really have a free will. We are accountable for our will, but the freedom of our will is limited by our fallen spiritual nature. In other words, he wants to argue that there's a sense in which we are responsible for the decision we make, but we can't help but end up making some of the wrong decisions because of our fallen nature. Well, now we're focusing on determinism, and we have to realize that what's coming through this discussion from Hobbes is determinism is not just the assertion that all things are caused by the laws of nature, but all things are caused in such a way that it could not be otherwise. They've been exclusively predetermined. This view must reject the notion or idea of free will. They're clearly incompatible. For if things are determined mechanicalistically, then so is man's thinking, acting, feeling, value, and willing. Well, man is a machine. I've given you some information if you're interested in following through on this. Carl Sagan is interesting on the same topic and very contemporary for you. However, there have been some responses to the concept of Hobbes' view, and I've given you some indication of those here. I've called it new materialism, just to help you follow through on it. I've given you a number of books and other references, and some further material. I'm not going to spend much time on this, or into a debate with J.J.C. Smart, who came up with this interesting identity thesis. I've given you some of the information there. I've given you some of the questions that a number of people have, including I have, about that. But more significantly, I think it's important to come to behavioralism, which in a sense has been impacted by the materialists' views. We have a distinction with behavioralism between soft behavioralism and hard behavioralism, and you'll see how it's connected to the discussion we've had before. Soft behaviorism is a view that the description of observable behavior is the psychologist's task, whereas hard behaviorism says that observable behavior is all there is. In other words, the only thing you can talk about behavior is what actually happens. It's metaphysical. It doesn't take into account, in a sense, motive. But coming out of this distinction is the work of B.F. Skinner. And Skinner doesn't develop his views philosophically, or is affected by them, he reduces the total person to a physical state. He defines free will and all, he denies free will and all human transcendence. In other words, he is really finding himself back in the hard, mechanicalistic materialism of Hobbes. He reinterpretation of values as being dependent on social contingencies and conditions, which is a modification. That's not a law of nature, that's a law of society. It's a purely physical interpretation of all levels of human activity. And lastly, and most importantly, the importance of the environment shaping a person's behaviour. And that led to his views on operant conditioning. Perhaps the best illustration of that is Pavlov's dog. All I'm pointing out on this particular discussion for you, again, is background, is that the views of materialism came through and affected psychology. And you'll often discover that psychology and philosophy are often intimately connected, interrelated, in fact. It may help you discussing determinism to take note of some of the things I've mentioned on this slide, dealing with universals and free will, and I will leave you to look at that if you're going to follow through on that issue. And before we close out this discussion, it does affect causality, the issue of causation. And if it is true, as Hobbes argues, that everything happens in accordance with the laws of nature, then it means that causation is fundamentally deterministic. In other words, it's going to come about the way it does. That creates some interesting problems from understanding science and moral theory, of freedom and responsibility. And the question that really arises is that an adequate explanation of causation? Is it an adequate explanation of all the events that are taking place in the world around us? And are there elements of transcendence that confront us whether we like it or not in this three-dimensional world in which we live? So we'll leave those there because we're going to come back to causality, in particular when you deal with Locke and Hume, and so that'll become a much more significant issue, but you're going to see some of the background to it. But before we leave this unit, let me remind you again of the worksheet. And use the slides. I'll make that correction on the slides before I release them to you, so you'll know there's the correction. I've forgotten the slide number, but you won't need to worry about it. You'll see it there. And in the meantime, I hope you found this helpful, and thank you so much for watching.